Would you ever believe that one of the world's strongest alliances in modern history could turn on itself? In this shocking and intense scenario, we witness a dramatic twist of fate, an unimaginable crisis that pits the United States against its longtime allies in NATO. As nations scramble to navigate rapidly shifting alliances, global powers teeter on the brink of an all-out worldwide conflict. In the following story, we unravel the high-stakes drama that threatens to plunge civilization into chaos. Prepare yourself for an epic journey of politics, betrayal, survival, and hope as we explore the final stand that could redefine our planet's destiny. In this video, we dare to ask the unthinkable. What happens when the very pillars of geopolitical stability crumble? How does a world built on collaboration cope when trust is shattered and former allies become adversaries overnight? The following narrative offers a riveting chronicle of how the storm clouds gathered, the battles escalated, and how ordinary people struggled to find meaning and safety amid the madness. This is a story that challenges not just the foundation of alliances, but the very nature of human resilience. Join us as we embark on a suspenseful odyssey into the heart of a conflict so massive, it redefines the boundaries of modern warfare. This is a cautionary tale, one that underscores just how fragile international relations can be when pushed to their limits, and how the unthinkable can become all too real. If you've ever wondered how quickly the world could spiral into chaos, or how societies might cope in the face of a seemingly insurmountable enemy, then brace yourself. You're about to witness the ultimate test of alliances, loyalties, and the human will to survive. Stay tuned until the final moments, because in a conflict this monumental, every second counts. It began with a whisper, a faint rumor at first, bouncing through intelligence channels and clandestine gatherings. Officials in Brussels, home to the NATO headquarters, reported rising tensions with the United States over trade disputes, defense spending disagreements, and foreign policy mishaps. Leaders on both sides tried to contain the friction behind closed doors. But as frustration flared and negotiations disintegrated, those quiet murmurs grew into thunderous accusations. What started as a standard diplomatic spat transformed into a catastrophic rift that no one, not even the most seasoned diplomats, could have anticipated. Picture a grand hall in Brussels, the setting for a crucial NATO meeting. Delegates fill the seats, representing the alliance's many nations: France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, Turkey, and numerous others. Typically, these gatherings center on enhancing security ties and discussing global challenges. This time, the conversation is heated. Accusations about lopsided defense budgets, political manipulation, and perceived betrayals spill over into a tense standoff. A hush falls as the U.S. representative stands, glaring at the assembly, and delivers a speech that will go down in infamy, an ultimatum that effectively challenges NATO to reevaluate its entire structure or lose the American partnership. On the other side of the Atlantic, the White House. The president, under intense domestic pressure over economic crises and internal political upheaval, calls a primetime address. Citizens across the United States tune in, expecting a standard statement on foreign policy, but instead find themselves confronted by a whirlwind of rhetoric. With resolute words, the president claims that the United States has borne too much of NATO's financial burden for too long. The calls for reformation are clear, sharp, and filled with escalating threats. The president insists that unless European and Canadian allies contribute more, the US will exit NATO altogether, severing a partnership that has spanned decades. A wave of unease cascades across Europe as the realization sets in. If the United States follows through, NATO could lose its main pillar of military power overnight. Immediately, leaders in key European capitals scramble to address the crisis. News programs run 24-hour coverage, filled with grim faces, analyzing the potential scenarios. Citizens question their safety. Defense ministers hold emergency sessions. But the U.S. stance remains unyielding. Adapt or prepare for the dissolution of what was once considered an untouchable alliance. Days turn into weeks of negotiations. All the while, the global economy takes a hit. Markets react nervously to the uncertainty, with stocks plunging as major corporations express alarm at the potential unraveling of international security. For a moment, it appears that a last-minute deal might be possible. NATO officials draft a revised treaty, one that addresses certain American concerns about fair financial contribution. Yet, behind the scenes, a new layer of complexity arises. Intelligence reports suggest that the United States and other global powers are secretly forging alliances that conflict with NATO's established protocols. Rumors of clandestine deals with non-NATO countries swirl. Accusations surface that the U.S. might even be sharing sensitive defense technology with outside powers, shattering any remaining trust between NATO and the United States. As the negotiations collapse, the climate becomes more explosive by the day. Protesters fill streets in European capitals, brandishing signs proclaiming unity or condemning perceived American betrayal. Some crowds, especially in countries that have grown heavily dependent on U.S. military support, carry banners beseeching the United States not to abandon them. Across the Atlantic, American citizens question the sudden isolationist pivot. Even so, numerous Americans applaud the decision, convinced that the U.S. has overextended itself on the global stage for too long. While the diplomatic rift intensifies, each side begins reinforcing its military posture. Troop movements occur discreetly in Europe, with European Union forces conducting exercises near borders. The United States deploys additional warships to strategic locations around the world. What was once routine training now pulses with the energy of potential engagement. Politicians spew fiery speeches, fueling an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. In the midst of this mounting chaos, a flashpoint emerges, an event so cataclysmic that it tips the world over the brink into open conflict. A covert U.S. drone strike, intended to neutralize a suspected terrorist cell in a Middle Eastern region, accidentally hits Allied forces from a NATO member state on a classified mission. Outrage sweeps NATO leaders. No immediate apology can quell the anger unleashed by the tragic loss of soldiers who had been operating under the alliance's command. Demands for reparation intensify, but the U.S. administration refuses to accept blame, insisting it acted on legitimate intelligence. In their eyes, the unfortunate friendly fire incident is a regrettable but unintentional mishap. For NATO, this is the ultimate betrayal. Conflicting narratives pour into the media, each side blaming the other for lack of coordination. Any lingering goodwill between the U.S. and NATO shatters irreparably. Suddenly, the unimaginable becomes inevitable. The U.S. announces its complete withdrawal from NATO, labeling the alliance a failed experiment. NATO leaders gather for an emergency session where a resolution is passed denouncing the U.S. actions and imposing immediate economic sanctions. In turn, the U.S. leadership hammers back with its own set of retaliatory measures, blocking exports, freezing assets, and imposing crippling tariffs on NATO nations. As each side escalates, a new geopolitical order swiftly takes shape. Lines are drawn, alliances shift, and the globe stands on the precipice of World War III. The first open military confrontation occurs in the volatile waters of the Black Sea. U.S. naval vessels, on high alert, clash with naval ships from multiple NATO members, responding to what they see as an act of aggression. Skirmishes erupt, with shots fired and vessels damaged. The tense standoff highlights just how fractured and precarious the situation has become. Diplomatic back channels exist, but lines of communication are severed at alarming rates. Leaders no longer trust each other to negotiate in good faith. As conflict spreads, each region wrestles with its own part in the expanding war. The Middle East, historically dependent on Western military support, finds itself pulled in conflicting directions. Certain governments remain loyal to the U.S., hoping to secure beneficial defense arrangements now that America operates outside NATO restrictions. Others side with NATO, believing that a diverse coalition is safer than relying on a single superpower. Local militias and extremist groups exploit the vacuum of global security, seizing more territory and capitalizing on confusion. In Asia, nations that once carefully balanced relationships between the U.S. and NATO now confront a stark choice. Russia, widely seen as an adversary to NATO, forms a strategic partnership with the newly independent U.S. In a twist that stuns political analysts, Russia's leadership finds more common ground with an America operating outside NATO constraints than with a weakened coalition whose unity is visibly cracking. China, another powerhouse, sees opportunities to expand influence, forging tentative economic pacts with both sides. Diplomats jockey to secure favorable trade routes and resource access. Meanwhile, smaller Asian nations grapple with the question of which side to align with, mindful that a miscalculation could lead to devastating consequences. Latin America becomes an arena for proxy battles, influenced by either NATO or U.S. support. Revolutions, counter-revolutions emerge in some countries, instigated by covert operations aimed at installing governments loyal to one side or the other. Africa, too, is not immune. Strategic territories, coastal regions, mineral-rich zones become crucial negotiation tools or battlegrounds. Local governments weigh the benefits of siding with NATO's broader coalition against the might and economic leverage of the United States. The war is not only fought on land and sea. Cyberspace becomes a primary battlefield. Both sides unleash sophisticated hacking attempts, trying to cripple essential infrastructure and communications. Power grids flicker, banks find their systems compromised, and misinformation floods social media. Civilian populations are bombarded with propaganda on an unprecedented scale, making it nearly impossible to discern truth from manipulation. Each side wages a relentless war of narratives, hoping to erode the morale of both enemy combatants and foreign populations. Against this global backdrop, the daily life of ordinary citizens is filled with uncertainty. Families worry about whether their loved ones will be deployed or if their cities might be targeted. Shelves in some countries empty as supply chains break down, leading to food shortages and rationing. The tech industry, heavily reliant on international manufacturing, faces catastrophic disruptions. The automotive sector halts production because of key components stuck in war-torn supply routes. Oil and gas prices skyrocket, crippling transportation and industry. In many places, rolling blackouts become the norm. Amid the chaos, protests rage around the world. People flood city squares, some chanting anti-war slogans, others demanding government protection. In the US, a new wave of patriotism competes with widespread anti-war sentiment. International watchdogs try in vain to orchestrate peace conferences, but few top officials are willing to appear weak by attending. The wheels of war turn faster, with each side convinced it must demonstrate strength to force the other into submission. As battles rage across multiple theaters, NATO and the US each double down on advanced weaponry. Hypersonic missiles, next-generation fighter jets, and lethal drone swarms become the face of modern warfare. European factories churn out arms day and night. In America, the defense industry booms, with states competing for lucrative contracts. Technological leaps accelerate, driven by the desperate need to outpace the enemy. All the while, nuclear arsenals loom in the background like a silent existential threat. Neither side wants to escalate to nuclear warfare, but rumors surface that strategic warheads have been moved to more forward positions. Both NATO and the US send ominous warnings. Crossing certain red lines will trigger full-spectrum retaliation. With each day of warfare, the unthinkable possibility that nuclear weapons might be used becomes more plausible. On the ground, soldiers struggle with the moral ambiguity of fighting in a war that has turned former allies into bitter enemies. Many American soldiers find it almost surreal to engage armies they once trained or collaborated with in joint exercises. On the NATO side, veterans who once praised the bond with the US must now treat American forces as a top threat. The emotional toll weighs heavily on combatants. Some question orders, while others resolve to follow through for the sake of national honor. Countless families find themselves split by the conflict, with relatives in different countries caught on opposite sides. Humanitarian crises multiply. Refugees flee border regions, straining the capacity of neighboring countries. Medical facilities scramble to treat an ever-growing list of casualties, while also battling shortages of medicine and supplies. International aid organizations, some historically reliant on US or NATO funding, face moral dilemmas. Accepting funds from either side may be seen as picking a team, jeopardizing their neutrality. In an effort to reclaim the diplomatic ground, neutral states attempt to broker peace. Switzerland hosts a clandestine summit, inviting delegates from both camps under the banner of humanity's collective survival. These discussions, however, get bogged down by mutual accusations. The US insists NATO must lift sanctions and recognize American sovereignty to form new alliances. NATO demands accountability for the friendly fire drone incident, the immediate withdrawal of US forces from contested zones, and compliance with existing international treaties. The summit disintegrates in acrimonious stalemates. Back on the front lines, what started as contained skirmishes now flares into large-scale operations. NATO's Europe-based forces mount a major offensive to push US allied troops out of a strategic corridor near southeastern Europe. In turn, US missile strikes take aim at critical supply routes, hoping to cripple the alliance's ability to coordinate. The tension is so intense that the entire world holds its collective breath, waiting for the next cataclysmic move. A decisive turning point arrives when a major NATO power, deeply intertwined economically with the US, secretly negotiates with American envoys. Their leadership grows disenchanted with NATO's leadership, believing the alliance's structure is collapsing under the weight of so many different national interests. In a dramatic public announcement, this key European nation declares its withdrawal from NATO and signs a defense pact with the US. The alliance is left in disarray, morale plunges, and neighboring countries scramble to determine how to react. This major defection shifts the balance of power, emboldening the United States to intensify its pressure on the remaining NATO members. At this juncture, major global institutions such as the United Nations try desperately to intervene, passing resolutions that call for an immediate ceasefire and the start of crisis negotiations. Yet, enforcement proves challenging. The Security Council becomes paralyzed by vetoes and conflicting interests. Some countries see an opportunity to settle old scores or gain territory amidst the chaos. Regional conflicts explode in intensity, each overshadowed by the larger war but intricately connected. The conflict's toll on individuals cannot be overstated. Scenes of displaced families, shelled cities, and economic ruin unfold. Private citizens describe the heartbreak of losing loved ones in what seems like an unwinnable global catastrophe. Social media is flooded with desperate pleas for help, tragic images from bombed-out neighborhoods, and accounts from frontline medics struggling against impossible odds. International tourism and travel grind to a halt as flights are cancelled, borders closed, and entire regions declared war zones. Yet, in the darkest times, small acts of humanity glimmer. Civilians on both sides carry out grassroots efforts to provide humanitarian aid. Volunteers risk their lives to transport food and medical supplies across contested borders. In some conflict zones, local truces spontaneously arise as soldiers and community leaders agree to brief ceasefires to evacuate the wounded and bury the dead. These fleeting moments remind the world that beneath the grand political machinery are real lives interconnected by universal hopes and fears. Months drag on, and the war's exhaustion becomes a global epidemic. Even the most hawkish leaders sense their economies and societies are strained to the breaking point. In the battered capitals, fear of a potential nuclear escalation grows. Whispers of back-channel discussions between the US and NATO intensify. Under immense internal pressure, certain NATO leaders reach out to Washington with a new proposal: a phased approach to demilitarization in key conflict regions, partial lifting of sanctions, and a structured path to renegotiating military alliances. In the United States, public opinion shifts dramatically as reports detail the human and economic costs of the war. Soldiers returning from the front lines share stories of devastation that clash with official narratives. Grassroots anti-war movements swell, bridging ideological divides. Members of Congress from both major parties form a bipartisan coalition, calling for an immediate end to hostilities. Similar movements ignite across Europe, challenging NATO leadership to rethink an unyielding approach. A carefully orchestrated negotiation begins in a neutral city, Vienna. High-level representatives from the US and the core NATO nations meet secretly. Over many days, talks vacillate between cautious optimism and fiery deadlock. The memory of all the casualties on both sides weighs heavily, and no one wants to appear weak or betraying national interests. Yet the undeniable reality emerges. Continuing down this path edges civilization ever closer to nuclear confrontation or total collapse. Eventually, an outline for peace takes shape, a new framework for security in the 21st century. It features a joint command structure to handle crises, equitable defense contributions, and the inclusion of any nation willing to adhere to transparent, verifiable arms limitations. The question remains, could the U.S. rejoin an alliance that it vilified, or will it insist on forming a new entity entirely separate from NATO's legacy? Different proposals are floated. The talks stretch into weeks, and the world holds its breath for an agreement that might halt the bloodshed. During a pause in negotiations, a major crisis erupts in the Pacific, a region that has thus far avoided direct confrontation. A large-scale cyber attack cripples a nuclear power plant in a critical area. Both sides blame the other. As meltdown fears rise, it appears the talks may collapse, obliterating any chance of a deal. The delegates in Vienna rush to address the incident, each side desperate to prove it had no part in the sabotage. For a moment, it looks like a mutual understanding emerges, that this war has spun out of anyone's control, fueled by extremist factions, rogue agents, and opportunistic powers who thrive in chaos. The incident sparks a renewed commitment among the primary negotiators, who realize that if they fail to contain the war, none of them may survive the next catastrophe. In an unprecedented display of unity, American and European leaders deliver a joint statement condemning the cyber attack and vowing to root out those responsible. This public show of cooperation helps calm international markets, and a fragile sense of hope seeps back into the global consciousness. Finally, after nearly a year of global turmoil, the peace accords of Vienna are announced. The agreements call for an immediate ceasefire, monitored by neutral peacekeeping forces. Each side agrees to withdraw from contested zones, and a third-party arbitration committee is formed to resolve disputes. Economic sanctions are gradually lifted, while a massive global aid plan is launched to rebuild the war-ravaged regions. The accords also introduce a fresh blueprint for global security cooperation, one that merges select elements of NATO with a newly created international framework in which the U.S. participates as a leading member, but under constraints designed to prevent unilateral action. Signing the accords is a bittersweet moment. Countless lives and global resources have been lost to a war that many historians will label senseless. Still, people cling to the possibility that humanity might learn from this cataclysm. On the day of the signing, images of leaders from once warring nations standing side by side fill television screens worldwide. Tears of relief and heartbreak flow in equal measure. In the aftermath, rebuilding proves almost as challenging as the conflict itself. Infrastructure across multiple continents requires massive repair. Millions of refugees must be resettled or returned to their homelands. Wounds of betrayal and bitterness linger. Generations will grapple with the social and psychological scars. Yet, amid the rubble, new alliances and friendships form. Scientists collaborate on sustainable energy projects, spurred by the war's devastation to reduce dependency on foreign oil. Communities previously at odds unite to patch roads, restore schools, and revive local economies. Amid these trials, a collective awareness emerges. The future of humanity depends on cooperation, not dominance. Even as great powers remain wary of each other, the lessons of the war resonate throughout every corridor of power and every home touched by the conflict. Citizens everywhere vow never to allow old alliances to fester into new rivalries again. So ends this gripping chapter of human history, a testament to how alliances can fracture and how, through unbridled aggression, the world can be pulled to the brink of total destruction. Let this story stand as a reminder of our shared responsibility. Regardless of national boundaries or political affiliations, humanity's survival hinges on our ability to communicate, negotiate, and compromise. Though we have explored a terrifying scenario, World War III, a conflict that once seemed impossible, hope can still guide us in times of turmoil. The final message remains unmistakable. We must forge understanding and unity, lest we repeat the dire mistakes that nearly destroyed us all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a disturbing yet sobering vision of the future. Your willingness to engage with these stories demonstrates the power of collective awareness. Only by facing our darkest possibilities can we illuminate a path toward peace. If you found value in this journey, please consider sharing it with friends, discussing the ideas we've raised, and reflecting on how each of us can play a part in shaping a more stable, compassionate world.